So should we get underway? It is just a minute after noon. Welcome everybody. I'm Kirk Gutjahr. I'm the Managing Director for the Center of the American West, and this is the fourth installment in our Lunch with Limerick series. Today we welcome former Secretary of State Phil Kiesling from Oregon, or Oregon Secretary of State, and CU Denver historian Cameron Blevins in a talk entitled, or a conversation entitled, "The Post Office's Central Role in American Life, an Advocate for 21st Century Voting by Mail and a Historian of the 19th Century Post. Get Acquainted." It will be we're going a little bit longer today because there's plenty to cover in this territory. Just so everybody knows, we do record all of these. They will be available on our website next week, so you have an opportunity to join there. And if you want to register for our upcoming events, we have 2 more events in this series on immigration. It's called The Party of Practicality, an innovative and pragmatic conversation on immigration, featuring historians Mary Mendoza and Thomas Jimenez and Congressman Joe Neguse from Colorado. The first one is next week on October 6th in the evening from 6:30 to 8. And the second one is on November 13th from 12 to 1:30. You can go to our website, find out more information about that and plenty of other activities that we're engaged in. We do have a Q&A option at the bottom of the menu, and we have had our best success trying to blend those questions in during the course of the conversation instead of having a kind of dedicated Q&A hour as you often see in public events. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the Center's Faculty Director, Patty Limerick.
Thank you. What a pleasure to have this opportunity. I am really proud of both of the people we have with us, because I really shaped their lives and careers. So that's a ridiculous remark in many ways, but Phil Kiesling was my former student many years ago, certain number of years ago, and Cameron Blevins was never my student, but he did get his book manuscript extremely commented on, wildly and overpoweringly commented on by me, and Phil got a few written comments on papers in the past as well. So Phil and Cameron have 2 things in common. They have me and they have the post office. And enough about me, and on to the post office. Phil was the Secretary of State, as you've already heard, in Oregon. And I will say I'm just going to say this because he's my former student. I can be proud. He is the major reason that Oregon led the nation in having mail ballots as their form of elections. And Colorado was in your trail, in your slipstream, but you were ahead. He now has an organization called Vote at Home, and he'll tell us, I hope, a little bit more about that as we go through the discussion. Cameron has just moved. He was at Northeastern University as a professor of history there. He's just moved to CU Denver, so he is our neighbor and comrade and colleague. He went to Pomona College, and he went to as an undergraduate, and then to Stanford as a graduate student. So, and Phil was my student at Yale, where we were Westerners in a weird world there at Yale, and
yeah,
that's really fun to have that together. So we are going to start off with Phil telling us about how and why and the good parts and the bad parts of the post office and mail ballots becoming so much a center of national attention in 2020.
Yeah.
So Phil.
Thank you, and just a delight to be here and merge these 2 centuries, the 21st and the 19th. And let me start by saying that the whole idea of a mailed out, mailed back ballot dates to the 19th century, and specifically to the 1864 election, where Union soldiers were fighting to save the Union. And there was a presidential election, which was not postponed, held even in the midst of a civil war, as rightly so. And a conundrum: how do we let Union soldiers who are fighting to save the Union vote in order to express their preference for the president that they would support? And this innovation of the mailed out ballot emerged from there. So if you think about it, what seems strange to many people in the context of 2020 is more than 150 years old. But the second thing is that every state, all 50 states, have for decades let people vote by mail, i.e. by a ballot that is mailed to them. It's been easier in some states than others. Some states require an excuse. Most now don't. In fact, though, they're almost universally called, quote, absentee ballots. That's actually a misnomer because in most states, you don't have to prove an absence or any reason. You can just get one for asking for it. But 30 million people voted this way in 2016 in the presidential election, a little bit more than that. And thanks almost exclusively, quite honestly, to COVID-19 and the global pandemic, it may well be close to 80 million this year. And while that's not a huge number, it literally represents less than 1% of the volume that the Postal Service will carry on a given day. The prominence of that many more ballots has obviously attracted a lot of partisan controversy. And if you step back, there's probably never been as rapid or a dramatic a change affecting so many Americans in the simple mechanics of how they vote than what we've seen just between the last election cycle and this one, with the prominence of the mailed out ballot and, of course, by definition, the US Postal Service. If you were to Google the term US Postal Service late delivery, you probably would have gotten 100 times as many hits in the last 9 months than you did in the previous 9 years. Suddenly it's front and center because of COVID. And it happens to be one of those classic examples in American life where changes that have been going on in the Postal Service for decades, controversies, partisan arguments in Congress about how the Postal Service is managed or how it can be run like a business. All those things have been percolating for a long time. But with COVID-19 and the focus on the mail for delivering the election, suddenly the Postal Service has exponentially more focus than it's had in a long, long time. So in a year like no other, where COVID-19 has changed our lives in so many ways and will continue to do so for years to come, the mechanics of how voters connect with their ballots and how they actually cast them suddenly has thrust the US Postal Service into just an unprecedented spotlight, if not a Klieg light.
Excuse me, my mute button was on. Patty, this is a unique thing I will share with the audience. So when Patty's home phone line rings, it essentially cuts off any Zoom conversation that she has, and she will be back here in mere moments. But Cameron, I think we'll turn it over to you and hear a little bit more on your research and background so we can fuse these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to an absent Patty right now for inviting me to join here. This is hopefully going to be a nice conversation, and I've already told Phil that I'm mostly interested in hearing have what he has to say about the current state of affairs, but I can offer some historical context for kind of the U.S. Postal Service more generally. So the USPS really goes back to the very beginning of the nation. The 1792 Postal Act, one of the first major landmark establishments of a brand new nation, established in many ways a very expansive postal system, in some capacity more radical than existing ones. And in particular, it was established as a means of tying together this kind of new nation, but one that's also geographically quite dispersed. And its primary kind of role at that time was to carry news between all these kind of spread out states. And it subsidized the transmission of newspapers from the very beginning as a means of kind of knitting together the nation, carrying political news, right? What's happening in governments, the nation's capital, and really was a force for kind of integrating this nation together. Kind of the middle of the 1800s, you have this period of really, really rapid Western expansion, which is my personal kind of interest in this topic, was looking at how the nation so quickly occupied, conquered Western territory, right? In the span of roughly a single generation, beginning the 1840s through the 1880s, roughly, expanding into the Western United States. And what I found is that the US Postal Service was central to this project. It was far and away the most expansive arm of the federal government. It had more people working for it than the entire rest of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch combined. It was the largest postal system in the world by several orders of magnitude. There was, essentially speaking, a post office in every town or community in the country. And its ability to really expand into these distant places so quickly was, I argue in the book that will be coming out next year, a primary accelerant for this process of Western expansion. Until by the year 1900, there were about 75,000 post offices in the entire country. To give you a little bit of perspective, that's about 2 to 2.5 times the number that exists today. And to give you more perspective, if you were to add up every single, I have this written down somewhere because I love this this fact, but if you were to add up every single McDonald's restaurant, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, Burger King, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Wendy's, Dairy Queen, and Domino's Pizza, you add them all together into some giant kind of Frankenstein fast food conglomerate, there'd be fewer locations than there were post offices in the year 1900. So just giving you a kind of idea for just how expansive and widespread this network really was. Moving through the 20th century, it takes on all sorts of new roles. It develops rural free delivery, which means that the post starts delivering mail directly to the doorsteps of people living in the countryside. New sorts of innovations, parcel post, it begins delivering packages beginning in the early 1900s. But by the 1960s, you're starting to see a kind of creaking infrastructure that's under a lot of stress. There are strikes going on, there are labor stoppages, mail starts piling up in big cities, in part because there's been a lack of investment at the time into this infrastructure. This eventually culminates in the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act, which is this kind of big landmark in the history of the postal system. Up until that point, the USPS was basically received funding from taxpayers. It did generate some revenue, obviously, with postage, but most of the years it ran a deficit. In 1970, Congress decided that they were going to cut off funding, public funding from the postal system, and it was supposed to generate its own revenue, right? Be fiscally self-sustaining. This was a huge shift, but the problem is that Congress also then imposed its own set of requirements about what it was and was not allowed to do. Something like on the very first page of this act, Congress members from rural parts of the country made sure that in one of the first bullet points of this law, the USPS was not allowed to shut down facilities in places that were unprofitable, such as their rural districts. That continues through to today. We can talk a lot more about the various kind of burdens that Congress has placed on the USPS while also expecting it to be fiscally self-sustaining, that I think explain a lot of some of the issues around it right now. But that's just kind of the big picture overview of all the U.S. Postal Service history in about 5 minutes.
That was really great. I was departed for a lack of internet connection for a minute or so. So Phil, I missed the last part of your remarks, and if I ask you a stupid question that you already had answered, you'll know what happened to me there. So Cameron, how come you weren't scooped by historians of the past? I mean, it seems like the post office is so important, and historians are forever studying letters, going to archives and looking at letters. And so were your predecessors bewitched? And why did they never ask, how did these letters get around? How did they get around? Or, I mean, I know you're very lucky that they were deadened in curiosity because you got to write the book, but what was up with that? And the reason I'm asking you that is, if we had been asked to think about the post office and its deep and consequential history and its centrality to civic life, would we be less addled as a nation now? If your people interested in post office had been more active earlier on, would we be better off? Is there a way in which that history would just keep us from flying off the handle in ways now? So how come they left it to you, and what have we paid? What price have we paid by that?
Sure, and I'll do the scholar thing, which is to say that I'm not the first person to ever write about the post office. There are wonderful historians that have written about it, but I think one of the reasons why this institution really, in some ways, has gone unnoticed and continues to go unnoticed today in some ways is the fact that when something is everywhere, you kind of start to lose a sense for what it actually is, right? Imagine walking down the street, you really pay attention, you even notice the number of different kind of street signs, electrical wires, all this kind of infrastructure that is everywhere. And that was the US Postal Service for basically since the start of American history. And so it's rare that we kind of stop to look at that really mundane infrastructure that does connect things together. And so one of the things that I ended up doing was looking at the actual spread of the infrastructure itself that I think helped me understand just the full scope and reach of it. And that was using this kind of wonderful data set that a stamp collector made about every post office that ever existed. And if you actually map out where those are located, you can see this giant network that's spreading over time and kind of infusing all these different corners of the country. But to kind of link it to today, Phil brought this up in the beginning, right? Is that you're seeing a spike in interest in the post precisely because of this moment of crisis. It's almost like umpires or referees in sports. The best ones are the ones that you never notice are there, right? And I think it's only the times when there's this kind of very public jostling about, what should the post be? What should it not? Is it coming under attack? That's when people really start to notice these kinds of ubiquitous things that they mostly just take for granted otherwise.
So Phil, I may be doing a disservice here by thinking you said something you didn't say, but I thought that you said in a conversation that we had recently that because journalists were not covering the post office for long, long spells, when they were summoned to cover the post office, they weren't really, they were inclined to become overwrought, or they were inclined that there was something that just was not in their training system. And we have paid a price for that in some ways.
We have. And in addition to my being a recovering politician in the 24-step program, because it does take us longer,
36.
I'm a former journalist, worked both locally and for a national magazine, the Washington Monthly. And I have been struck by what I will call the tendency towards apocalyptic journalism that's been going on right now around the election. There's a lot more, you get a lot more attention for the article that summons this awful picture of the constitutional crisis, and there's all sorts of new wrinkles to that possibility that go far beyond what we saw in Florida in 2000. But I'll give you two examples. When the summer started, a couple of big stories and visuals that were in the news. One of the big stories was all this sorting equipment that was suddenly being decommissioned in places around the country. Well, because I've worked with people in the Postal Service for a long time, and both the labor side and the management side, it became pretty clear to me when I looked into that was not a nefarious plot as much as it was, we're just not processing as much mail anymore. Do we need these pieces of equipment? Most of them were not in key states, but because some of them were, this then fed into a narrative about some evil conspiracy. The other was, and people may remember this, all those pictures of the postal boxes that were scrapped and looked like they were getting ready to be crushed in one of those big metal things that, where cars go when they die. That's been a routine service that's been happening for a long time. Maybe there was more of those than usual. But it wasn't as if it was suddenly this great expose of a plot to kneecap the Postal Service because they were recycling old blue boxes. And in fact, as a friend of mine who's as attuned to this as I think any other, but is with the National Letter Carriers Association, he goes, Phil, if there really was this evil, nefarious plot to destroy the ability of people to get their ballots delivered and back in time, that would have happened in September or October. That would not have emerged in June and July as this huge story. Now, I don't want to underplay the fact that there have been real problems in the Postal Service with lack of funding. Cameron, your point is just excellent. The Postal Service, in a sense, has been asked to do an impossible mission by an irresponsible Congress. And I'm going to put the blame squarely on both parties on this one. They don't let the Postal Service charge a going rate for a stamp. We have one of the cheapest first-class stamp rates in the world at 55 cents. Yeah, it's 9 times what it was in 1970. 9 times. Oh my gosh, what terrible inflation, those crooks, but those price gougers. But You go to Denmark, it's $4.
Really?
You go to France, it's over $1. Japan, it's over $1. The UK. We are half to a third or more, or even less, the cost of first-class postage in most of the developing world. And that's because Congress, in addition to saying you can't close down postal offices without our permission for the most part, you have to operate at a profit, you have to put on your books full accounting for your pension obligations, which is nearly unheard of in other places. Oh, and on top of that, you can't raise the price of a first-class stamp beyond inflation without special permission. So we have, in a sense, a series of self-inflicted wounds, and I lay the blame on Congress, President too, because they have to sign the bill. And we've also allowed, let's just say the popular culture to denigrate the Postal Service in ways that it's never deserved. I mean, I like Jerry Seinfeld, he's funny, but Jerry Seinfeld has had a shtick for decades. And remember, Newman in that show was a postal carrier, and it's about the last person in the world you want to carry your letters, much less do other things. A dazed and confused, distant branch of the Cub Scouts who walk around in their embarrassing shorts and jackets with meaningless patches and victory medals. I mean, this is just slander on the people that I've gotten to know on over the years in Oregon when we introduced our system of voting exclusively with ballots that were mailed out. And I like comedy, and comedy often gets close to the edge, so I'm not going to think Jerry Seinfeld is awful, but it's an example of a culture that has been allowed, in a sense, to not understand what Postal Service does and appreciates it, and it's faded into the background too much. And now suddenly, as it roars into the spotlight with COVID-19 and the election, there's just been a lot of myths and misunderstandings about the situation. Most people, for example, probably don't know that 40% of Amazon packages have some Postal Service delivery component. I think FedEx often helps deliver the last mile. And that gets to something you said, Cameron, which is the rural part of America is heavily subsidized by the urban part of America when it comes to keeping the cost of postal delivery down. It's easy to deliver mail next door in my neighborhood or across town, relatively speaking. But we say to people, for 55 cents, we'll not only deliver the mail to your neighbor a mile away, but we'll deliver it to the remotest part of Alaska or Montana or Kentucky. Same price. Doesn't matter if it costs us 5 or 10 times more. That's our dedication to an America of equality. And I think that's actually one of the geniuses of the Postal Service, not a defect or a bug, but a virtue of it.
Oh, okay, so I feel like I'm time traveling here, and until you were back in olden days, I'd say your paper has so much in it and you covered so much, and I'm just going to have to take a while to break down the pieces here and put it together here, because that was great. What a wonderful statement. But heaven's sake, that was a short amount of time, but you covered so many things, all of which I want to follow up on. So we'll just take them one at a time here. One of the ones which never occurred to me until you just said this, Cameron, the representation of postmasters and everyone in the postal system in popular culture, was there anything equivalent to comedians making fun of post, or were they heroes? And I mean, neither rain nor snow nor whatever. So I don't know where neither rain nor snow, where that came from, what time that originated, but were they heroic figures that appeared in novels and might even have been featured, or were they laughed at, or I mean, help me with that. Never occurred to me to ask.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of different strands, at least that I've come across in archival material. The first one is this kind of like very heroic kind of thing. Especially you'll see this oftentimes with mail delivery in kind of the frontier in the Wild West, right? This image of a stagecoach with mail, getting chased by, bandits, that kind of thing. There's also the other side of it, which is complaints about the mail has been an American tradition since the very beginning, right? But I think one of the big shifts that happened historically is that through the early 1900s, the vast majority of the postal workforce were not full-time employees, right? They were not people wearing uniforms, driving trucks, making deliveries. They were overwhelmingly, 95% of the workforce was your local store owner, handing out letters to you while you're buying, coffee or bacon. They were a stagecoach company that is paid a private contract through the US government to carry a bag of mail along with passengers and freight. And so that actually gets back to a little bit of what I was talking about earlier about the ubiquity of something being a little bit invisible. And in the 1800s, in the first 100, 150 years of the Postal Service's existence, that was even exacerbated because the federal government was kind of overlaid onto these kind of private citizens. And that's a very different shape from what the postal system looks like today. And I'm not going to kind of weigh on whether that's better or worse. There are downsides to that as well, but there wasn't the same degree of kind of associating the postal system with this kind of giant federal bureaucracy. So,
well, and really such a private-public intertwinement.
Well, and Patty, also, during particularly the 20th century, and it's probably true in the 19th as well, Postal Service employment was a big patronage piece of government. So, James Farley, the Postmaster General under FDR, was a way to give people work. And when fortunes changed and one party lost control and another one came in, I think, Cameron, often postmaster jobs were at stake and maybe a lot more. So it became a way, politics has always been entwined with the Postal Service, or it's, I think in the more modern era, they've made studious efforts to depoliticize it. I think a lot of the postal unions have often not even made endorsements in partisan races, trying to keep friends on both sides, because again, they serve rural, they serve urban, and have tried to be an honest, tried to take that kind of tack. But it is interesting what in popular culture, and I think they've been more invisible than anything else. Although if you step back and think about it, very few people who work for the government have a chance in vast geographies of America every day to see what's going on. And the number of people that check in, whose lives have been saved by postal carriers noticing something a little amiss at the doorstep and delivering or picking up mail. There are all those stories. I mean, if you think about it, there are eyes and ears on the ground in lots of neighborhoods and rural communities across America that no other entity, serves to kind of keep an eye on things.
And thank you for that. Exactly what I was wanting to have Cameron say a little bit about the post office as a social center, which I, as a kid in Banning, California, we had that. My father had a post office box, and one of the worst things my parents ever did to me was to have me practice driving a stick shift in the Banning post office parking lot. And to get out of that damn parking lot, you had to go up a tiny hill, and in my father's Volkswagen, I stalled it 19 times with everyone in Banning in the post office watching me stall it there. So I can say that it didn't end in the 19th century, that sense of the post office as a place where everyone clumped and gathered. I had not realized how enraged I am. It's possible that my big sister, who was on this call, was the person who was trying to teach me to drive at that moment. So it's very possible, but let it go, okay? Let it go. Anyway, the notion of the community around that seems really important, and the notion of how hard it is to think of a similar form of deep engagement between a federal agency and everybody's day-to-day life, which of course you say.
Exactly right. Well said.
So Cameron, would you say a little bit more about the social coming together quality, and what I wouldn't have thought of without reading your book, but how rural free delivery really broke a lot of the ties of that community. So am I asking?
Absolutely, yeah. So through the roughly the end of the 1800s, outside of large cities, the way in which you got and sent mail was you'd walk down to your local post office. That helps explain why there are so many post offices. And so the idea would be that you would gather at this place to, pick up your mail, send something, read a newspaper, gossip with neighbors, catch up with people. But that also actually ties into the patronage angle, which is why these positions were so highly sought after as this form of political patronage, was that if you were a local store owner, suddenly if you also had a postmaster position, that meant everyone in the community had to come into your store to get their mail. And this is the way in which politics were really deeply tied up with these local communities as both centers of socialization, but also kind of centers of commercial transactions as well. And so you would see, it's interesting, Phil, I was kind of thinking as you were talking about this, it's really almost a return back to the 1800s now with this kind of highly partisan nature of, you know, the postal system in the last, you know, 1 to 2 years. The Postmaster General today in many ways bears a lot of resemblances to the Postmaster General in the 1800s, which would have been highly partisan figures. You know, leader of, say, the Democratic, you know, National Committee would be put in charge of the post office, not because he had any particular skill in managing a bureaucracy, but because he would install tens of thousands of local Democrats into office. And in doing so, you know, help them with their local businesses. So it was a vehicle for patronage, but the way in which that it also centered communities, I think, is really fascinating to think about. I don't think there's, as far as I've been able to tell, there was no equivalent, such a widely shared kind of ritual across the United States. No matter where you go, the local post office is going to be there. And there's kind of good sides of that and bad sides, which I'm happy to get into, but that was a defining feature of life in the 1800s in a way that made it more universal, I think, than almost any other institution I can think of, public or private.
And let me, if I can briefly tell the origin story of the system in Oregon, by which every registered voter is automatically sent a ballot in the mail. And I want to take a quick aside here because there has been mass confusion, much of it deliberate, I'd argue, on part of certain people, to fail to distinguish that there are about 10 states right now in this November that will automatically send ballots to everybody, unsolicited, okay, if you want to use the word that the president has used. But the other 40, you still have to solicit your ballot. You have to apply for it. It's a bit of a Shakespearean matter. I've told people to have to apply or not to apply. That is the question right now. And the truth of the matter is the vast majority of states are continuing to use the framework that they've been using all the time. They're just having a lot more people choosing option B. In fact, so many people are choosing option B, I'm going to get my ballot this time through the mail rather than getting it in person, that it's become more used than the default option. The default is still the polling place in 40 states for this election. But I want to go back to 1981 real briefly because this story about how Oregon came to this starts with a guy named Del Riley, who was a World War II vet. And, you know, vets in World War II depended on the Postal Service, you know, for writing home. I mean, the Postal Service did an extraordinary job. Back in the 40s, of course, mailed twice a day and 6 days a week in many cases. And it started with a single question. He asked, if I'm printing and sending out all of these sample ballots through the mail, what's wrong with sending out the real thing? And the people who heard the question initially thought it was kind of crazy, stupid, you know, it's just outrageous. Why, you really can't do that. And he kept going, well, why can't I? Why can't we? And I think one of the reasons that when he finally got permission to do it, it was a Republican Secretary of State, Norma Paulus, who pushed through the legislation in the early 80s. I think most people who voted regularly in these smaller local elections, because that's what most of this was done, they were in their 50s and 60s. They had grown up, Patty, in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. They had kind of known of the Postal Service in those times when it really, in some ways, was at its apex of performance and kind of prominence in American life. And so when this clerk, Del Riley, proposed that, well, let's just ditch the polling place. Okay, let's just mail everyone their ballot and they can mail it back or deliver it in person. I think a lot of people went, oh, I could see how that could work. How are you going to make sure it's me? Well, we'll just check every signature. Oh, yeah, I can see how that would work. And the combination of those two things let the idea take hold. And as it took hold, people then said, this is really good. I like this. And it might have had the same thing of the rural delivery, the free rural delivery, A lot of critics said, oh, you've destroyed the community feeling of going to the polls and crisp blue skies and the crunch of autumn leaves. And a lot of voters were going, yeah, I kind of missed that. But many of those days it was pouring down rain and I had to get home early to get my, dinner on the table. And it was my car broke down, et cetera, et cetera. I think people realize that we have been confusing a certain ritual of the democratic process that was familiar and beloved by many, but we were confusing the ritual with the essence, which was participation. And so it took hold very quickly. I almost liken it to that great work of Western literature by Dr. Seuss, Green Eggs and Ham, where the lead character spends the whole book trying to convince, the other character to at least try it, and all the objections. But when people finally tried it, they went, wow, why didn't we do this before? And the result is creating a new ritual for many of them around their kitchen and dining room tables, often with kids, friends, and other family members. So I think we benefited by having the origin of this come at a time when that positive view of the Postal Service was probably at its apex.
Interesting. So I do have to report, this is what a wonderful medium we have in Zoom and the geographical reach. My sister in Fontana, California would like everyone to know that she was not the one teaching me to drive on that occasion when I had the troubles. We've had that report. So there's just no telling where this whole medium is going to take us in instant oral history. Just great to have that happen. I want to say something that I happen in terms of this notion that there is really a heritage of positivity around the post office. I want to say a word about the work of one of our affiliates, Allison Jefferson, very talented scholar in Southern California, who wrote about African Americans in Los Angeles and in Santa Monica. I have read her manuscript on that, and she has person after person in the African American community in Santa Monica who became a civic leader, played an enormous role in community morale and improvements of all kinds in civic life, and they worked for the post office. It was just curious reading her manuscript and another inspirational biography, and he was a mail carrier for years. I thought, this is something I simply hadn't attended to. And that wretched act of Woodrow Wilson in the segregation of the civil service, apparently he didn't get to that. Apparently the period of time that Allison's writing about, it seems like whatever Woodrow Wilson planned to do in the way of mischief to social justice, he didn't get that in the post office. So anyway, the way in which working for the post office was a route of upward mobility for African-American men, I didn't get that until I saw that. So that seems really important. I would like us to go, at least for a couple of minutes here, about legitimate concerns about voting in 2020. Just to say, it's not unfounded to have some zones of anxiety.
Yes.
About what happens.
Let me talk about that. We have experience over those 40 years. Oregon in 2000 became the first state in the country to move the system away from only local elections to primary and generals, including presidentials. And we held the first presidential election this way in 2000. And I think the next statewide that did it was Washington 10 years later, and then Colorado 2014 midterm, 2016 presidential. But what are the valid concerns? Well, there are two directions of mail. One is the outgoing, and one is the incoming, or the return. Okay, and are there cases where mail gets delivered 3 days before that should get there in time? It doesn't. Yes, sometimes even 7 or 10 days. Absolutely. Do postal letter carriers sometimes unfamiliar with the system, particularly new states? Have they made mistakes and not known how to properly deliver ballots in either direction? Yes, that's happened. Has mail gotten in late? But one of the things that people often don't look at is why it gets in late. Is it late because the Postal Service failed to meet its 2 to 3 day standard? Or is it late because somebody decides on election day itself they're going to mail the ballot back and it has to get there by 8 p.m. that night? That's unrealistic. You can't blame the Postal Service on that, but the reporting that's done fails usually to distinguish these sorts of things. The biggest single problem, and the reason that people who choose to vote with a mailed out ballot are going to have that ballot ultimately not count, is not at all the Postal Service being inordinately slow. The biggest reason is they don't follow the instructions on the ballot, or their signature is determined not to match. And the instructions are sometimes really stupid. I mean, you can get a ballot thrown out in the state of Pennsylvania right now if you don't put it in the secrecy envelope that then gets put inside the return envelope. This is the so-called naked ballot problem. And there's been some funny viral videos that have gone on about that. But it's an utterly ridiculous requirement. There are states that say you have to date the return of your ballot, and not just date it, but if you put 20 rather than the year 2020, it gets thrown out because technically you haven't complied with the law. But the biggest reason is signature matching. And signatures do change over time. People sometimes forget how they signed their voter registration card 10 or 30 years ago. This age and other factors can cause signatures to change. Young people sometimes are still trying to sort it out or might forget. And those are the kinds of things that we have to work through that can increase the odds that a ballot in the mail is ultimately not going to be counted. And of course, every one of those is a tragedy. But when you look closely at a lot of what's happened, the ultimate culprit often is the vendor who sends out the ballots, not the Postal Service, or it's the voter that doesn't quite understand the instructions because they're unfamiliar with it. I don't want to blame the voters either. I am reminded of what's that quip by Frank Lloyd Wright, that, well, doctors bury their mistakes. And of course, you can see those in the local cemetery. Architects get to cover theirs up with vines. And every person whose ballot ends up not counting because of a glitch in the mail back process is very visible. But how many millions, if not tens of millions of voters wake up on election day with good intent, and then life intervenes? Bad weather, kid gets sick, a relative is in the hospital, the car fails to work, the boss calls you in for an extra shift. We never know what those numbers are, who are technically disenfranchised because of logistics. But we know every single voter who gets arguably disenfranchised because their mailed out ballot somehow doesn't get to the finish line. So it's not a perfect system, and there are legitimate problems, but we've worked things out. For example, in Oregon, we don't even call a vote by mail anymore, at least I don't, even though the law technically calls it that. 70% of people in the presidential election voted in person. They literally, quote, vote in person, not vote by mail. They get their ballots in the mail, the sending out part of it. But the returning back, they walk it into a drop site, those secure boxes, or they take it to a city hall or a library. And literally there are partisan fights going on right now in places like Ohio, and Texas is the latest, where state law or the governor has said, we don't want to let a local government even set up a secure drop box. We're going to say that you can't even do that to help facilitate the return of ballots for people who want to do it in person. So yeah, there's problems that can happen and we've had our share of them in Oregon over the years. But if you look at the numbers, they tend to be a lot smaller than what's suggested, but because every one of them is visible, they tend to get the play. It's like the letter from Aunt Mabel that gets delivered 60 years later. Those stories almost always, get in the news, and I've seen a few of them even now that I'm sure play into the narrative of you can't rely on the Postal Service, even if it's 99.9999%. That ballot will get back within 4 or 5 days.
So I want to do a little round on nostalgia, but I want to start with something that didn't occur to me until just now, but handwriting is really on the ropes, and Palmer method and so on going down. And I wonder if this signature thing isn't just something that really needs rethinking, because people's signatures seem like a very flawed form of I guess we'll call it communication, or of identification. So is there, and I'm dwelling on that just because that seems like a key way in which
Yeah.
things can go awry. And given the slippage in the human capacity to hold a writing instrument, is that just an enormous unit of vulnerability to the whole notion of mail-in ballots if so much rests on the signature?
It's not enormous, and we've talked about this in our state for the last 40 years, and we've definitely seen more people forgetting how their signature is. So it does seem like a vestige that over time may be more and more problematic, that might get replaced with other kinds of verification tools. Some states don't require a matching. They just require that there be a signature, and there are other things connected with the ballot that give them the assurance that the person is who they say they are. I think it's important, particularly when you have leading politicians casting all sorts of myths and, I'll just say, lies about the process, because the amount of fraud is so infinitesimal, it's almost laughable. Although, again, I've prosecuted a few people in my time who did sign a ballot that they shouldn't have signed, and they got caught at it. But I think we've got to keep an eye on the issue of signatures, and one smart way that people have dealt with it in our state is that since you can now digitize signatures very easily, you just keep a record over time of how people's signatures change or what their variations are. And when you do the verification and you have a question, it doesn't seem quite right. If you have 5 or 10 previous signatures from previous elections, you can very quickly resolve those. And almost every signature that is kicked out at the first glance because something doesn't quite look right gets proved up. And the other thing that's important is the curing process. The states that do it right notify voters when their ballot is determined not to have had a matching signature or a missing signature, and then they get time to cure it, often just by submitting a new signature or voter registration card. And a lot of court suits have been going on in the last few years to require that of states, and that's a real positive thing because that further mitigates the problem that you have. But I think for the time being, it's it's the best thing that we have for that kind of verification. And it also gives people assurance about it. We found that the fact that the signature verification happens in 100% of the ballots. Really, Phil? It's not a random sample. You do for all 100% in Oregon? Yeah, have for 40 years. That really helps put a damper on these overheated, wildly inaccurate claims of fraud and people filling out, ballots. I mean, you're not going to succeed in having the ballot count, but you'll commit a felony every time you try it. And so this vision, this actually happened in 1864, Cameron, with the presidential election, and people filling out and signing, hundreds of soldiers' ballots. It got caught because a single person blew the whistle and it didn't affect the election. 400 felonies got caught. But I sometimes think the President of the United States has been reading the 1864 newspapers to get his information about what goes on with mailed ballots, because signature verification has long since become the norm.
Oh, well, the very notion of reading in that remark was an interesting idea.
Let's not go there.
Okay, let's not do that. Why did I do that? Oh,
my apology for going there.
You tempted me. You tempted me. That was very bad of you to tempt me in that way. I want to say something about, I certainly don't want to say something about green eggs and ham, which is now locked in my mind from your having invoked that. So I'll get that out of here. But I want to talk about, have you both talk and bring Cameron into this too. Was there a golden age of voting, a democratic moment where citizens fully participated in a process of integrity in which individual and group decisions were reflected in the count and that was all announced in a prompt and reliable and credible way? Could you tell us about that golden age of voting? Let's start with you, Cameron, since you're the historian.
I mean, the pithy answer is no. But that's kind of the historian's approach, right? I mean, you can trace it back throughout American history. I think there's, as I kind of talk about with my students, right, there is a tendency amongst a lot of Americans to imagine this kind of relentless upwards march of progress for the United States, that things are always getting better and that we're getting more inclusive and et cetera. And it's really not, right? It's a case of moving forward, moving backwards. And so I think assuming that there is any kind of golden age is always a little bit dangerous. And I could give a million examples of that. And it kind of depends on really what I think is a more interesting question is what you are using as criteria for what you want, what you think the nation should be in terms of what voting looks like and democratic participation, right? So during the late 1800s, had some of the highest rates of voter turnout in American history. It was also one of the most corrupt, partisan ranked episodes in American history. The parties themselves were kind of flipping back and forth. It's the great era of forgotten presidents, right? Who remembers, Grover Cleveland or Benjamin Harrison, right? So it's kind of like how you define, it's the Gilded Age, right? There's corruption going on, despite the fact that there's really high voter turnout. Or you could say the progressive era in the early 1900s is this kind of flourishing of grassroots democracy. There's all sorts of legislation passed to get regulations in place. This is when ballot measures become popular in some states. On the flip side, this is a period of disenfranchisement for African Americans, especially in the southern United States. And so it's really kind of like you're kind of playing whack-a-mole, I think, in terms of trying to look for that golden age of voting. And I think at the risk of making myself and my profession feel obsolete, I think oftentimes those conversations are a lot more about the present than they are the past. And at the end of the day, I think it's way more important for politicians and Americans to just think about, what do we want it to be now, right? Instead of hearkening back to what did the founders think in the 1780s? What did they want the postal system or voting or whatever to be? I mean, for me, it's like that's a good context to help explain how we get here. But at the end of the day, I think the question is, what do we want the postal system to be? What do we want democracy to look like? And history can certainly help give some context for that. But the conversations that always kind of like look back to the past, I think oftentimes can do more harm than good in some ways.
Right. And well, Phil, why don't you come in on that and I'll have a follow up there.
Well, thanks, Cameron. Those are great points. And one of the things that I looked into recently, and the U.S. Election Project website is something that's very useful because Dr. Michael McDonald and his team have tracked participation in major elections as a percent of the eligible population, okay, which is the adults over 18 that not serving time in prison under some state laws. But you're right, the 1880s, 1890s saw some really high levels, but of course then in the, after Reconstruction ended, in the Jim Crow laws, the Black population that actually voted because they were excluded systematically, then plummeted. And it's also interesting, 1918, when the pandemic happened with the Spanish flu, it was the first time in a number of decades that participation of the eligible voting population in midterm elections fell below 50%, according to McDonald's data. Do you know when the next time that it got back to over 50%? 2018. So for over a century, we had fewer than half of the eligible population vote in midterms. And in the last presidential election, 2016, we only had 60%. And if you step back and you say, well, what does that mean? That means close to 100 million Americans who were eligible to vote failed to cast a ballot even in the presidential race in 2016. Now, 2020, with the pandemic, here's the irony. I think because so many more people are voting with mailed out ballots, and they have that ballot in their hand now, they don't have to worry about connecting with it on election day and navigating lines and logistics. I think we may have a record in terms of eligible numbers of people who are casting a ballot, at least in a presidential election, and despite a pandemic, where it had plummeted in 2018 because of the pandemic and people's fear. Now that it's been developed, it's familiar in certain states, it's how we do things. I think the potential is that we'll have record-shattering turnout. And so here's how the Postal Service, in a sense, can play a role in however your partisan views are. I have long argued, even gotten kicked for it, that I think we're better off in the long run, and our democracy is healthier, if 80% of the eligible voters cast a ballot and all my candidates lose, than if 60 or 50% cast a ballot and all my candidates win. And I think one of the most invidious notions that's crept into an American life, and you see it in a lot of these reality TV shows, but I'll trace it back to the immortal words of Vince Lombardi, the famous Green Bay Packer coach. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And this notion that it doesn't matter how the rules get played, doesn't matter, who participates, as long as you can win. And both the Democrats and the Republicans over my time as an observer in an office have preferred lower turnout elections because they think it would help their candidate. We finally passed a vote by mail bill in the Oregon legislature in 1995. I'm a Democrat. It got vetoed by our Democratic governor, I think more for sentimental reasons than not, but he was pressured strongly to do it by the Clinton-Gore reelection campaign and the Democratic National Committee because they thought it would be bad for Democrats. Then we held a special election for a Senate vacancy within a year. The Democrat won. The Republicans now decided it was bad for them, even though it started as a Republican idea. And I have watched over the years as major politicians in both parties have a fear of how higher turnout will help their opponents more than it will help them. And I think they're both losing sight of small d democracy. And if you think about what's the essence of our community life is together, our civic life, it's regardless of how the results play out, won't we all be better off if as many of us as possible have weighed in on that decision so we can be held accountable for it? We can't blame the people that voted and we didn't. So I think that the introduction of the mail-out ballot, and particularly in states that automatically mail it, I tell people that if Oregon's turnout rate had been matched in 2016, and we were not a battleground, but if it had been matched elsewhere in the country, we would have had 20 million more people vote in 2016. Now, would that have changed the outcome? I don't know. We'll never know. But I don't care. Might have given Trump even, a bigger victory. Might have won the popular vote. Who cares? Okay. It would have been better for us as a country if we'd had all those extra votes, because many more of us would have been engaged and continue to be engaged. So that's my sermon about how this is important going forward for how we think about our civic community.
Although I will say, Phil, as a new resident of Colorado, looking at the mountain of ballot measures that I'm expected to vote on November 3rd, the idea that I am qualified to decide whether or not the Denver clerk's office should reorganize into 3 separate divisions is maybe a slight devil's advocate argument against having me be involved as a voter in too many decisions.
Yeah.
But anyway, but overall, I do agree with that.
Yeah, but it's interesting when I've asked people over the years what they like most about it. Many of them talk about the convenience and it does save money. But what most of them tell me is that they think they cast a more informed ballot. They get a chance, if they run into something like that, to at least go to the internet or call up their brother-in-law or their older sister and get some advice about it or some insight. And that's been a value add as well. That sense that when I've done doing my civic duty, I feel I've cast a more informed vote.
Do you have, does every state have what we have? I would assume so. And this is a terrible thing because I want to give a really strong tribute to them. The people who prepare the blue book thing that we get that has
voters pamphlet?
What, sorry?
It's called the voters pamphlet, you mean? That gives information about it? Yeah, a lot of states don't, particularly in the East Coast. It's more of a Western phenomenon.
I got to be interviewed by the people here in our state, and I'm so sorry, at the Office of Legislative Counsel, I can't remember what it's called, but I think that's it. Anyway, they interviewed me on fracking because I'd done work on that, and I have never felt so well attended to and then summarized. And they don't, they do the arguments for, they do the arguments against. Those are amazing things. And I think, Cameron, without that, I would be with you in thinking, help, because the language is not always transparent. And so, but with those folks who I think are the key figures, that I've never had a chance to celebrate them publicly. So pardon me, I'm just taking one more second. Because boy, do they do a good job. And I would feel sad for people in a state that doesn't have such a service. That's really hard. Okay, so boy, I'm so excited about remembering those people who I just adore. Anyway, so okay, I want a quick question. This will be really fast. Given everything you said here, can you think, we're kind of shifting the golden age thing, toning down the goldenness of it. can you tell us a time when democracy was not in some kind of crisis in citizen participation?
No. Every election is the most important election in one's lifetime. I've heard that. I think all the time I've started voting, the first time in the presidential election, 1976. Um, it's, you know, it's politics ain't beanbag in the words of many over the years, and it's a contact sport. And we almost start the campaign cycle the day after the last one finishes. Um, uh, so you know, and so we'll argue about what we you know, whatever we think will serve our cause, politicians will tend to use. I have little doubt that if mail-out ballots prove to be much duller and less of a problem than many people fear, some people who feel aggrieved are going to find another thing. The voting machines that, for example, aren't directly marked by voters with ballots, which is an issue in Georgia and Philadelphia and other places. The provisional ballots, people move. You know, the Postal Service, one statistic, 36 million people change of addresses in a given year. And a lot of those are voters. And a lot of them forget to tell their county clerk that they've moved. And so when election comes around, they're not technically enrolled at the local precinct. What do? Well, most states are pro-voter. They let people update a registration or vote a provisional ballot, but that's a whole different sector, and maybe that's going to be what people focus on. But you know, we're this election, even with extraordinary circumstances, still has a lot of those core elements of the drama that you see in every election, with people asserting that the other side's using nefarious tricks and all sorts of apocalyptic visions of what could happen. So I tell people to have patience. And the single most important thing is don't expect the final result on election night itself. Could happen if it's a blowout, but don't expect it. But give it 3 or 4 days. It's not going to take a month. Very unlikely to, but could. You know, never say never, but most likelihood it'll be known in 2 or 3 days. And what's an extra day or two? The republic is not going to dissolve and slip into the ocean if we don't. Most of us don't know who the president is going to be on November 3rd and have to wait till November 6th.
I wonder if you could both think of ways in which history might be helpful in calming it down between now and November 6th or 3rd.
Cameron, I'll let you go on that.
Because I guess the frenzy of anxiety about what mail will mean, that this morning's New York Times says that in Philadelphia, the Democrats are now pushing for vote in person because they think that the distrust is and anxiety about, so they're actually backing away. Well, some people in Pennsylvania, I don't know what percentage are with that. So I'm just thinking, this is really not an occasion of reasonable calculation and evidence considering, and maybe that's out of our reach, but is there some way that, particularly an appeal to history and deeper thinking in time, well, if not that, what's the strategy for getting a calmer, deep breathing reckoning with what to be worried about in the election, and to what degree to fixate on the post office as a problem? And that, how can you tone that down? I think it would be inappropriate to imagine a lot of prescription drugs as the route to do that, but tranquilizers or sedatives. I mean, I'm okay with that, and almost I'm not really okay with that. Please, let's not say that. Why do I say these things? But what would be a good alternative to prescription sedatives and tranquilizers for just bringing the agitation down on this issue?
Man, so you're tasking me with calming down one of the most partisan eras in American history. This is great.
And you,
well, I think
your historian card, using your credentials there, if they are useful. Yeah.
So I would say that we have experience. For me, I guess, let me just kind of back up for a second. I'd say that the biggest thing is what Phil mentioned earlier, which is that I actually do agree that the infrastructure of the U.S. Post is incredibly solid, right? And they've mentioned the fact that the number of mail-in ballots that they're going to need to handle is actually not like a huge thing for them. It's not some unprecedented day, right? Christmas every year is way more material that they're actually transporting. So I think the infrastructure I'm actually fairly, confident in that. I think the bigger issues are the ones that Phil points to, right? Which is what happens on either end of that. And that to me is less of a kind of acute crisis that we should be like fixated on, right? In part because it's really, we have 50 different elections happening, right? Because it's a federalist system where each state is in charge of its own voting. And I think that, I have my students look at differences in voting eligibility, voting processes in different states. And it's just mind blowing to them that someone in Colorado versus someone in Alabama can face a completely different voting landscape. And so I don't know if that helps tone things down at all. It's still kind of anxiety ridden to think about, oh, wow, there's all these different things that could go wrong in different states. But taking a step back from that, I think to think about the bigger issue, which is, partisanship, I think, is as high as it has ever been. I really, I wish there was some historian in me that could say, well, actually, it's been worse in the past. Partisanship is as bad as it's been. Having said that, there have been other times of partisanship that have ended far worse, right? I mean, the 1850s is the prime example where we literally had a civil war. I do not think there is going to be a civil war on November 3rd. I'm fairly confident that, using my historian credentials there. But I don't really know. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Patty. I mean, you are also a historian here, but I struggle with that question because I have students ask me that as well, and I want to be able to offer some kind of reassurance here. But it's hard sometimes.
Yeah, I do have a thought, but I will go to Phil for his. We'll come back to me if there's time for that. But Phil, what are you thinking about how to counter the agitation? I think, Phil, that when you can I just compliment you for a moment here that your remarks, I've not heard that from many people, that you would prefer to have 80% of the people vote and to have your preferences for the election results lose. I don't hear a lot of people, maybe I need to ask them the question, maybe they are dying to tell me, but I just keep chatting and they never get a chance to tell me. But it seems, I wonder, that doesn't seem normal. Your attitude there doesn't seem, but it seems like if it could spread, that would be a solution right there. If more people said, well, as that guy said the other day on that cool webinar when he said, if 80%, so I don't know. So what are you thinking about?
I recall back in 1996 when we had this special Senate election, first time in US history that a federal office had been filled by this kind of an election. And a conservative columnist corked off, where on earth did we ever get the notion that the president of Columbia University should be treated the same as the ignorant, let's just say garbage sanitation worker when it comes to elections? And I responded very directly, it's right there in the Declaration of Independence and in the US Constitution that all of us are created equal. And we have been on a journey since the Constitution to be true to that vision. We still aren't there, but we started with 6% of the adult population being able to vote because we confined it to white males who own property, and we've been working to expand the franchise since then. And I have said, the polling place, arguably, and the insistence that that's the where you have to go to get your ballot, and it's your ballot, is arguably the biggest voter suppression tool in American life today. If you step back and think about it, the thing about this election that I think people have lost sight of, and maybe historians can help us with this too, is that we'll have actually paper documentation of more votes than we'll ever have had in modern American history, because by definition, a mailed out ballot is a paper ballot directly marked by a voter. Most states now have moved away from machine voting that is relying on software, and instead the software is confined to the counting of the ballots, but the ballot itself you mark directly. So the final safety valve is the recount, is literally physically going and looking at every single ballot. And we kind of saw that in Florida, the infamous hanging chads, because we probably had a 1 in 10,000 situation that a very close state also determined the presidency, and they used a really bad technology, which has now since been gone. But I think we need to, kind of step back and say there are processes in every state to physically inspect as the vast majority of these ballots. If I had my way, every ballot would be cast on paper, whether in person or through a mailed out ballot. Um, but I think that's going to be an important safeguard as well. But can we, and this is the question I ask, can we take that notion that at the end of the day, higher turnout is far more important than who wins, and use that notion as a way to kind of restore a sense of sanity and civility in American life? I hear a lot of voices, including my own state, that somehow thinks that the one person, one vote rule is obsolete. I think that's really dangerous. And it's often disguised as, well, the urban people are telling us what to do in the rural part of the state, and they're ruining our lives and our economy. And I'm sympathetic to the emotion of that, which is why I think that we need to be talking to each other a lot more so we can understand those divides and act in a more responsible way. But that's my biggest fear. And I think historians can help us with reminding about how adherence to that one person, one vote rule has served us better than not over the years, even when at times it hasn't, been perfect in the results. But I think that's going to be the real test going forward, is that basic principle by which we revolutionized politics and government in the 1700s. I don't see anything better to replace it, and I think we need a recommitment to it.
So in terms of me and my thoughts about what historians can do, as everyone will know, I feel very strongly that historians are the most underutilized resources of human resources, that in terms of very much like renewable energies, where you have solar and wind resources concentrated distant from the people who need the electricity. So in universities, you have historians just piled up, a whole bunch of them, all milling around and doing stuff, but there's no transmission line connecting those historians to the wider world. So it seems to me that if we could have, I don't want to say, emergency EMT, first responder sorts, EHT, emergency history technician, just out there. If there could be more of us milling around, I'm not going to say as poll watchers, because that's become rather charged recently as a topic, but just more of us out there as a presence of saying, and some of what we've covered of, yes, be worried, but be worried with precision and aim, and look at what is the legitimate worry, and by all means go into that. And then I'm thinking that maybe, and I know this would be quite a negotiation, but just a wonderful day, maybe once a month, where every postal delivery person is accompanied by an historian, and we just walk the route with them and chat with neighbors. Really fun. I would like to do that. In fact, there's no reason why I couldn't ask.
Yeah.
I happen to sometimes to be, because I'm home all the time, I see this person walk by. So maybe I go out and ask, could I join you?
Not just historians, Patty, but students and people in the community. Wouldn't it be interesting when you see your Postal Service say, is it possible I can do it? Now, there may be rules against it, but what a delightful thought for students and faculty, historians, and just citizens to see what it's like to deliver an election and in real time, and then over the next 32 days, not that I'm counting or anything, am I right? That's front and center.
Right. Well, I would say, that the silly phrase that's used all the time, to walk a mile in another person's shoes. Well, I don't think we need shoes, but just to go out there on that seems really interesting. The other thing I'm wondering is about a conscious and deliberate undertaking of good writers. Maybe we need fiction writers more to romanticize the post office. What do you think,
Cameron?
Well, novels of, they could have torrid romances. That would be interesting.
Solving crimes, Postal Service letter carriers by day and detectives by night who solve
their days and nights on that. But they could be having very lively personal lives. All kinds of things, but we have a program that I wrote about today in my blog where we're very successful at taking this program where we had people embodying concepts. So I was Urbana Asphalt West, and my friend was Sandy Green Hills West, and we had Suburbia Green Lawn West, and we did a thing on urban-rural tensions. And it's a morality play of the 14th century, basically, or 15th century. So we could do something along that order of having, I don't know exactly how that's, well, that's not, I'm going to cut this off because I have no idea what I'm talking about right now. And I'm going to ask you to come back because that is such a topic of interest these days. And so much of the polarization that has been escalating and seems so conspicuous in the 2016 election was about rural voters and urban voters, or urban and suburban. So could we go back and do a little bit more on the history of the post office as a, well, literally message carrier, I guess, in some ways, but the relationship and dependence of rural communities on the post office. And we have brief references to that so far, but just more on that and how maybe that could be a detoxifier of the antipathy and antagonism these days if we saw more of that alliance that rural areas might want to pursue with the post office and with, okay, so I'm doing a sermon. Phil earlier referred to a sermon, and now I'm doing that.
You want to start with that? I've got some thoughts on that too, but you want to start in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about also that for, the first, whatever 100 years of the postal system's history, the United States was a rural country. So by definition, its federal postal system was a rural system. But you did see a kind of division by starting in the 1860s, which is when the US Postal Service started doing residential delivery in large cities. And from that point on is when you started to see that division between rural and urban areas. And unfortunately, Patty, I think the idea of using rural versus urban as a way to kind of bring them together, history is actually the opposite. You saw like very fierce divisions between people from rural areas complaining about essentially the level of service that people in urban areas got, urban areas complaining about financially subsidizing mail service and rural areas. And I think what was fascinating to me looking at a lot of these debates was the way in which those kind of geographical divisions were actually took precedence over partisanship. Despite it being a very partisan era, you would have Republicans and Democrats from rural areas always kind of uniting together to try to lobby for greater and greater service or prevent the Postal Service from curtailing any kind of service in the West. And so I think there is a little bit of a tension there that you still see. And while I agree, Phil, that I think one of the good kind of, if we're thinking like more big picture about the postal system as being dedicated to serving every single American, no matter where you live, I agree. But I think there does need to be some kind of pragmatic decision making around what level of service is expected, where you live. So if I move to the middle of nowhere, should I expect to receive 6 days a week delivery, right? Or is there some kind of way in which this large organization can have latitude to adjust service in particular areas? And I think that's a legitimate question, right? Just because we've always been dedicated to the idea of universal service, I don't think that necessarily means we have to moving forward. I personally think we should, but I think it's a legitimate debate to have about, again, what do we want the Postal Service to be moving forward? And I think the rural urban thing is, if anything, just it's getting worse and worse and worse, and I'm just not sure the Postal Service is necessarily one that's gonna solve that. I will say, I think on the thinking of like silver linings or kind of bright side, what I've noticed is that over the last 4 years or so, there has been a deeper and deeper appreciation amongst Americans for really boring and competent government. I think people are kind of hungry for just the government to just work and not have to think about it all the time. I think the Postal Service embodies that, right? You get your mail, you almost never think about it unless, something goes missing, which is very rarely the case. And for the most part, people do their jobs and they're good at it, and we get services because of that. And I think if anything, that I hope moving forward, Americans will not be taking that for granted anymore.
One of the things that's an irony about the current discussion about mailed out ballots is that I'd be far more worried about the Postal Service having a 5 or a 7 day turnaround rather than a 3 or 4 if I lived in rural. because of the self-inflicted wounds that the wounds that Congress has done. And a lot of mail now leaves a local community, goes somewhere else in order to come back and get delivered across the street in the name of, quote, efficiency, but the failure of letting stamps, rise to the price that they probably ought to be. And rural turnout in Oregon is typically a good deal higher than it is in the urban counties when you give everyone their ballot. And of course, rural America is aging in many places, with the median age being 5 or even 10 years higher than it is in the urban counties in Oregon. And as people get older, we live in an aging society. Just those issues of mobility and are making getting your ballot in the mail much more appealing. And so a couple of people have asked the question about the two I wanted to answer. One is, can states go overnight like Colorado and Oregon have done? No. But, and that's why only 10 really are doing it this way, and 40 still going to ask people to apply for it, and they're struggling with the increased volume, not the novelty of it, it's just a lot more. And the other is the notion of women. And it's very interesting in the surveys that are done, women by about 10 percentage points are more inclined to request a mailed out ballot. Now, whether that's because Democrats are more inclined than Republicans right now in this charged environment around mailed out ballots, I don't know. But women live longer. They often, in older age, are single rather than living with a spouse or partner. And particularly if they're in rural areas, getting to the polls can be more of a logistical struggle than in other places. You're endangering your health even if there's no COVID-19, just because it's cold and it might be snowing in Michigan. So the isolation that many people are feeling, and you can, including in rural areas, having our elections start automatically with getting the ballot in the mail, almost a prompt, a poke in the Democratic ribs, as it was, that, hey, got something going on. And it's not just the presidential. In fact, this model has far bigger impact in primary elections that now determine most of the winners in most elections, because you win the nomination, you're going to win the race. Local elections for school board, for city council, for county commission. Those are the elections in some ways that are the foundational democratic elections. And when you automatically connect everybody with their ballot as a matter of rights, and that's why I'm such an enthusiast for the model that Colorado and Oregon has, and I hope spreads, you kind of rethink the notion of our democratic community. You say that the minute you register, it's now the government's job to send you your ballot. It's not your job anymore to go find it at a polling place or by applying for an absentee ballot. And that notion of what government's obligations are to all of us wherever we live, rural or urban, I think that is a touchstone that's important here, is that after the dust settles. Obviously, most people will still have to apply for it who get one, but the optimist in me thinks that as we step back, we say, well, let's at least try this for these local elections and gear up and experiment with it and see to what extent it makes us feel even stronger parts of our local communities. Because most of what matters are going to happen at the local community, be decided locally. We put, in some ways, too much stock on what does or doesn't happen in DC. Let's bring it back to a more local vision and boost turnout there as much as we can, and engagement. I think that's going to help people talk a lot more to each other, because even rural communities are quite diverse. I was on a call the other day about the suburbs, a poll that was done about the suburbs, and the woman who had done the poll in the focus group said, I'm so struck by how much more diverse the suburbs are today than they used to be. This notion that they're all white and they're all married couples and their kids in the backyard. And they said, that is just so not the reality in these suburban districts that I'm talking to. In some ways, suburbs are more diverse now than some places urban in terms of the politics of it. So a call for localism by which mailed out ballots might really reinforce, put that idea on the table as well, and one that I think it does more to even get certain parts of our population involved, minorities, women, younger people, et cetera, to have a more diverse set of voices in that conversation.
So I am thinking that there are not very many, maybe I'm missing something here, but it seems as if a lot of the language around the post office is idealistic and unifying in terms of that. And you had that beautiful quotation. I hope you have it in hand, Phil, that you can read to us from the wall or the ceiling or something.
The ceiling of the, yeah.
Yeah, so, because I do think in 1970, the Postal Reorganization Act, this language, the United States Postal Service shall be operated as a basic and fundamental service provided to the people by the government of the United States. Just that notion that the government is stepping forward for us. And there's complexity in how that gets executed in this law, I understand that. But the Postal Service shall have as its basic function the obligation to provide postal services to bind the nation together through the personal, educational, literary, and business correspondence of the people. So I'm trying to think, I mean, the Park Service Enabling Act is quite idealistic, but it doesn't say come together, bind, unify. I can't think of many other agencies that have anything like that in the mission. You will pull us together. So could you read the thing that you have from the?
This is on the main Postal Service building in Washington, D.C. Messenger of sympathy and love, servant of parted friends, consoler of the lonely, bond of the scattered family, enlarger of the common life, carrier of news and knowledge, instrument of trade and industry, promoter of mutual acquaintance, of peace and of goodwill among men and nations. And I would argue those wonderful aspirational notions to add a ninth, which is the carrier of democracy.
And if you put that with Cameron's point about how this is the agency that just goes around doing some work.
And does it well and competently, and so much so that it's not noticed most of the time.
Have that kind of language, and to have that, if they had very beautiful language and drop the mail on the sidewalk and have it blow away, that wouldn't be good. But that actually getting in the box and so on. So I just see it a tremendous potential to say, well, it's not potential, it's almost already in operation, to say this is what's holding it together in a time when not that much is holding it together. So, okay, so we are out of time. I'm going to make a quick reminder here that on Tuesday, October 6th, we're in the evening, we're having a forum with Professors Mary Mendoza and Tomas Jimenez and Congressman Joe Neguse talking about better forms of working together on immigration issues. So if we thought the post office was a little bit of a challenge here, now we got another one coming up here. So please join us at that. And now I still reserve the right to do what I always did when we could meet in person at Center of the American West events, which is to not only clap on behalf of all the people who were silenced and muted and can't do that in this particular format, but also to whoop with appreciation and gratitude. So thank you.
Patty got stopped in mid whoop.
It looks like she got stopped in mid whoop.
Yeah.
So I'll do it for her. Woo! Thank you, gentlemen, so much. Have a wonderful day. We really appreciate it. And thank you, the audience, for joining and spending time with us this afternoon. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.